Deus, nos salutaris nostre, Domine ex Deus, Filii ex Deus, Filii ex Deus, Deus noster, Domine ex Deus, Angeli, Ave Patri, Laudem Domino Maestatis,
Hey, how's everybody doing? Hope you're having a fantastic day. It is Wednesday, June 18th, and I have an awesome stream for you tonight. It's one of my Pope Leo the 14th update streams because we are in the Leonine era right now. We have entered into the Pontificate of Pope Leo the 14th. We have a lot of different addresses and homilies and letters and all of that stuff to go over because we want to be prepared. We want to be informed. We want to take the advice of many authors of Catholic action throughout the last century and to stick close to the chair of Peter. Stick close to the chair of Peter, hear the directives of Peter, and what Peter tells us to do, that's what we do. That's what we focus on. He gives us the program, and we listen and we carry it out. And actually, what's so amazing about Pope Leo the 14th in particular is he is a Pope of Catholic action. We have some awesome directives from him already. We can actually already get a bit of a directive order. You know, we could already see the different type of focuses that he has through his pontificate. So we can see what he wants us to do. And we can see how he envisions, especially, he's a broad thinker. He's a wide thinker. He's a huge thinker. He doesn't only think on the level of the individual, which he does. He tells us how we ought to carry out in line with the social doctrine of the church, the Christian religion and politics and in our daily lives. He doesn't always only talk about that area. He also talks about the broader, the diplomatic, the entire world. We've seen multiple addresses in the last two streams. If you watched them, awesome. If you didn't watch them, that's fine. These are self-contained, but I have both of them linked below. You would see that Pope Leo actually has a geopolitical vision. Pope Leo understands the papacy in a geopolitical way. Pope Leo, he understands mission, and he understands the various different ways in which the church's service to humanity, not only through necessarily explicitly talking about the gospel, but through more subtle ways, through ways which dispose people to hear the gospel. He knows through that sort of service to the world, he is able to show the value that the church has to the world, show the value that the gospel has to the world, and being able to acquire in a successful way all of those authentic human goods of things like unity and peace. So really, as I mentioned many times before, this for Pope Leo understands the diplomatic service of the church. He understands the geopolitical vision of that diplomatic service as somehow bringing about a modern version of the temporal authority and the temporal impact of the Pope. It's in a more diplomatic way, it's in a more subtle way, but it still carries out the same ends, but according to the exigencies of the modern world when the Pope barely has control over a portion of Rome. So this was very important for Leo. He has a lot of different addresses. He's continuing that theme of addresses that he's giving to the diplomatic services. He gave another address to the Secretariat of State, and he says important things there. He gives addresses, a few more. We get a few of the gaps filled in as well with some of the relationship between the Episcopal conferences and local bishops with the government. So there's a lot of good stuff that we've had over the last 2 weeks. I can't believe it's already been 2 weeks since then. So let's actually get right into it, starting on June 5th, because this is going to be from June 5th to today. I do them all the way up to the day in which I record. So June 5th to June 18th for those who are watching later. So on, I need to give Hassan mod back. So give me like 30 seconds so I can do that, so he can ban anybody acting like a monkey. Okay, let me just do this. Sorry for the dead air. It's all Hassan's fault. Add as moderator. Managing moderator too. Okay. So if you act like a monkey, Hassan's going to ban you. Nothing personal. Just don't act like a monkey, okay? So the first one was beginning in June 5th. And this is the audience that I was talking about. He gave an audience with the superiors and the officials of the Secretariat of State. He talked about very interesting concepts. He talked about the incarnational work and also the Catholicity of the curial work of the church. Basically, what this means is that the church, because of these two aspects, because the church is able to work within the individual environments of different nations, and the church also has a view to the whole. Therefore, you're able to have something that is has fidelity to the principles of Catholicism, but it also is able to deal with the local situation at large. And there's a better treatment later in a different speech that he gives, so I'm going to talk about this more. But it's actually very interesting. I actually hadn't thought about this as much when it comes to the diplomatic work of the church. The diplomatic work of the church is very unique compared to other mediators. So, like, for example, let's take the very recent example of the war between Iran and Israel, right? If you have, let's say, Russia or the United States go in there, or Oman, or whatever other country you want to think about, and they try to go in there, they try to help the two sides negotiate, they actually are not going to be able to negotiate in as an effective way as the Catholic Church and the Catholic Church's mediators are able to negotiate. So the church stands in a very unique geopolitical position, because the church, on the one hand, has fidelity to her principles. The church has a certain neutrality in all of these situations. So the church is not going to be somehow geopolitically biased towards whichever nation that they're talking to. They're really going to be concerned with peace. They're going to be concerned with unity, and they're going to be concerned with basically all of the principles of the gospel. So there's that on the one hand. There's the Catholicity aspect. Then there's also the incarnational aspect as well. So when it comes to the role of the Catholic Church, you look at the curia of the Catholic Church, you look at the diplomatic service of the Catholic Church. The diplomatic service of the Catholic Church is not simply a bunch of Italians. Like, yeah, we got to have an Italian. We got to have Cardinal Parolin on top. You know, it's just how things work in Rome. You got to have an Italian in charge of things. But it's not simply a bunch of different individual Italians. The diplomatic service of the church is something which it's universal. I mean, you got guys from South America, you got guys from Middle Eastern countries, you got guys from Africa, you got guys from Europe, you got guys from Eastern Asia. Really, you have a very wide breadth of different individuals who they're coming in here with a capability to understand. The church, as a mediator, is able to understand both sides of a conflict, because the church in her Catholicity has individuals who are on both sides of the conflict. So you can actually have people who have not only genuine sympathy for the plights of either side in one of these agreements, but they also have a genuine understanding of where both sides of the conflict are coming from. Whereas somewhere like, if you put in a United States mediator for a situation between Israel and Iran, obviously there's biases. Not only are there biases, there's a lack of understanding. Like, a random American isn't really going to understand the plight of both peoples. They're not going to be able to look at these things in as an objective way, not only in an objective way, but an understanding way. So this is why Leo is giving actually very solid and very intricate arguments for the geopolitical service of the church and the diplomatic importance of the church in being able to resolve these types of conflicts. So it's actually very, very interesting to see him preaching to the members of the curia and of the diplomatic service of the church. So beside that, on June 5th, he also sent a message to a gathering of priests in France. And he talked about missionary work in challenging ecclesial and social environments. And I mean, yeah, it's sort of the basic message of different exhortations when it comes to missionary work, because again, the overarching theme of the Leonine Pontificate is that Pope Leo is concerned with mission. When Pope Leo talks to young people, he's telling them about mission. When he's talking to priests, he's telling them about mission. When he's talking to the diplomatic service, he's telling them about mission. When he's talking to the Episcopal Conference, he's telling them about mission. No matter who he's talking about, he's telling them in their unique circumstances how they are able to carry out the mission of spreading the gospel in various different ways. Everything from, geopolitics to telling people about how like sports can be done in a way that is in a missionary environment, which he actually did have a really good homily on sports. He connects in sports and perichoresis, the doctrine related to the doctrine on the Trinity, perichoresis, the mutual indwelling of the persons. It's very interesting to have like a patristic doctrine of the relationship between sports and perichoresis, but we'll get into that later. Yeah, he talks about specifically missionary work in a challenging secularist, ecclesiastical, and social conditions of France. And this is what he says, and this is honestly not just good advice for priests. This is good advice for everybody who is involved in Catholic action, which everyone is in their own ways involved in Catholic action, which, by the way, if you haven't read it yet, which Pope Leo is going to talk about later, you should read Vatican II's document on the lay apostolate. You should read it. It explains a lot of this. But and it helps actually explain a lot of Pope Leo's pontificate. But this is what is said by Leo, quote, "I'm happy to be able to show you my paternal affection and to give you my best encouragement as you continue your ministry in the service of the people of God entrusted to you. To achieve this in the difficult and often challenging ecclesial and social conditions that you are experiencing, I invite you to anchor your life and your ministry in an ever stronger personal and authentic love of Jesus, who has made you his friends and configured you to him for eternity, and in a generous and unreserved love for your communities, a love marked by closeness, compassion, gentleness, humility, and simplicity, as the late Pope Francis so often reminded us." And this is the important part. In this way, you will be credible, even if you are not saints, and you will touch the heart of people who are farthest away from you, winning their trust and bringing them towards Jesus, end quote. So this part I think is very important because this is a piece of advice that often seems like liberal coded for a lot of people. They think that when you actually do missions to people, like let's say you have your parents or friends or any of these other people that you encounter in your day-to-day life, and these people aren't Catholics. And a lot of times you'll get questions, okay, how do I convert my parents? Or how do I convert my friends? Or how do I convert my wife? Or how do I convert all of these different people? But really, when you look at the advice of the saints, the concrete advice and praxis of the saints, when it comes to sharing the gospel and spreading the gospel in these sort of environments, what you see, and this is something that St. Peter Faber, he talks about. I translated and posted his letter on evangelism on my website. If you can find it, St. Peter Faber, and just look it up on Google with my name. But the point that the saints give, Peter Faber talks about, and what Pope Leo talks about here, is that there is a certain credibility to holiness. There's a certain credibility to holiness. Basically, what this means is that through the effects of the gospel, through the effects of love of Christ, through the effects of the sacraments, through the effects of the spiritual teaching of the Catholic Church, through all of these things within your life, you actually show yourself as what the theologians call a moral miracle. Moral miracle. And you yourself become a motive of credibility for these individuals because they see the ways in which the effects of grace has concretely transformed your life. And this is something that gets connected in with the teaching of the church on the lay apostolate and the primacy of conversion for the lay apostolate and for the duties of family for the lay apostolate. But what you see is that through the sort of spiritual exercises and through the effects of these spiritual exercises in sanctification, you actually become credible to these people. And the gospel itself becomes credible. And this is the way in which missionary work is actually ordinarily carried out. A lot of people think missionary work is ordinarily carried out through me going on a street corner and, holding up a sign about how Jesus is Lord, or Christ is King, whatever it may be. That is not primarily and fundamentally how evangelism is done. Actually, evangelism is done through these sorts of things. So that's an important point that he brings up. And what's awesome is he says, in this way, you will be credible even if you are not yet saints. Even if you are not yet saints. So when he's talking about saints, he's talking about a certain heroic or extraordinary, I'm using those in their non-technical usages, but a certain extraordinary or heroic holiness. You're thinking of like Mother Teresa, or you're thinking of somebody who, or for probably most watchers of my channel, Mother Teresa might not be the best example, like St. John of the Cross, okay? Like St. Thomas, these sort of examples of sanctity. He says that even if you are absent of being a saint, having this extraordinary heroic degrees of holiness, even the ordinary holiness that makes you able to carry out those precepts which have been imposed upon you in your state in life, and being able to avoid mortal sin, even these sorts of things are actually able to make the gospel credible to people in your day-to-day lives. And this is the advice he gives the priest, but this is completely applicable for all of us in our context of the lay apostolate, which is imposed on everybody, by the way. To be a lay apostolate, you don't need to start an apostolate, formally speaking. You don't need to go and start an organization dedicated to something. The lay apostolate is something that you carry out in your day-to-day lives, right? Which, again, read the decree from Vatican II on the lay apostolate. It's very good for explaining all this stuff for you. Okay, then June 6th, he talked about, he had this audience with the Society of African Missions. If you're interested in that sort of stuff, you can read that. He's talking about foreign missions there. Interesting stuff. And then also he talks, he has a audience with the moderator of lay associations, ecclesial movements, and new communities. This right here is where he really digs in on a lot of the lay apostolate stuff. He talks about the lay apostolate. He talks about the hierarchical and charismatic graces and the distinction between the two. He talks about how mission is always done in unity with the Pope. He touches on a lot of very important stuff. So I highlighted a lot of this. But he says, quote, "The desire to work together for a common purpose reflects an essential reality. No one is Christian alone. We are part of a people, a body established by the Lord. When speaking of Jesus' first disciples, St. Augustine once said, they became God's temple not only as individuals. Together they were built in the temple of God. The Christian life is not lived in isolation." And this is another thing right here. The Christian life is not lived in isolation. We'll see him mention this quite a few times over the last 2 weeks, but his opposition to isolationism is huge. He says the Christian life is not lived in isolation as a kind of intellectual or sentimental experience confined to the mind or the heart. It is lived with others in a group and in a community because the risen Christ is present wherever disciples gather in his name. And this very context in which he is speaking this is the context of the lay apostolate. I mentioned earlier, lay apostolate, it begins with a sort of internal conversion. It begins with doing one's duties in one station in life. But really, the lay apostolate as carried out within the community on a broader scale, this requires the unity of purpose between multiple different people. And it requires being able to understand how to work with those other people. There's a certain limitation that comes with only working with oneself and not working with others in the lay apostolate. It says the lay apostolate was strongly encouraged by the Second Vatican Council, particularly in its decree on the apostolate of the laity. There we read that apostolic associations are very important also because the apostolate often calls for concerted action, either in ecclesial communities or in various spheres. Associations established for carrying on a common apostolate support their members, train them for the apostolate, and carefully assign and direct their apostolic activities. As a result, a much richer harvest can be hoped for from them than if each member were to act on his or her own. Other realities were born of a charism, the charism of a founder or a founding group, or a charism inspired by that of a religious institute. So before he's talking about the unity in association with others that are necessary for the apostolate. Now he's going to actually talk about those particular graces that are necessary. Because again, one of those emphases that I've mentioned in the last 2 weeks is that for Pope Leo, he's an Augustinian. And who is St. Augustine? St. Augustine's the doctor of grace, okay? So one of the most important emphases of the Leonine Pontificate is the fact that all of our activities, our apostolic activities, our activities in our various spheres in life, these are not activities which are moralistic. He denies this term moralistic. The reason he denies the term moralistic is because when you have moralism in his mind, moralism basically means when St. Paul describes establishing our own righteousness, or when St. Paul describes the works of the law. What St. Paul is getting at by those terms is by one's own unaided abilities, attempting to carry out the precepts of the gospel. St. Thomas, he talks about this when he discusses the evangelical law. He says the evangelical law can be treated as the works of the law if one decides to attempt to carry it out by their own powers rather than by the antecedent working of the Spirit in grace. So he's going to talk about two types of grace. So, and these two types of graces are going to fit in very closely with one another. And there's a whole letter from the CDF on this that you can read. So if you want to read that, you can read it. But these two orders of grace, the hierarchical, I don't know why I have such a difficulty with saying that term, hierarchical and the charismatic gifts. The hierarchical gifts, these are the gifts of orders. So obviously, bishop, priest, deacon. These are the gifts that come from the graces that come from the sacraments. That is that objective order out there, right? These are going to be those objective means of grace, out there, established by Christ in the sort of external function of the church, right? We need that. We need those objective means, or else we turn within ourselves to a sort of individualism that is very unhealthy and is going to detach us from the objective order of the church. And it's going to require a sort of self-reliance that cuts us off from communion with the church, cuts us off with communion from the Pope, and is going to lead us rather to ourselves and our own gratification rather than for seeking the good of the whole. That's why we need the objective order. The objective order is really what anchors and grounds us. But there's also the order of the charismatic gifts or the charismatic graces, or really this maps on a lot to the gifts which are gratuitously given. And you can read more about this. I believe it's Prima Secundae question, like 110, 111, somewhere around there in St. Thomas's Summa. He talks about the graces which are gratuitously given, right? So with a lot of these graces, the reason why these are so important because they're ordered towards something else. These graces are ordered towards drawing us into that objective order. So these are helpful because one, they bring us to something else, and that's very helpful. But two, because they're kind of like individualized. They're individualized, they're subjectivized. What I mean by this is they're able to fulfill very individual exigencies. Kind of, we can compare them to the way in which divine revelation relates to like Marian apparitions. What we see with divine revelation is an objective order, right? Divine revelation is giving us the sort of general propositions. Like divine revelation will tell us, pray and fast. And what you get in preaching is preaching brings about like the subjective order. Like preaching in the law of the church is going to individualize this and concretize this into our situation. So like when and how are you praying and you're fasting? This is kind of what Marian apparitions actually does. Marian apparitions are often specific messages from heaven, which are applying those objective principles of divine revelation into the time and space that we're here in now. So we need both of the hierarchical graces, which are those objective means, and they have a certain primacy and superiority. And then we have the charismatic graces, which serve the hierarchical graces and order us towards them. So when it comes to Catholic action, there's always going to be a connection and an interplay between these two levels. So he says, this too is an essential dimension of the church's life. I would like to invite you to consider charisms in relation to grace, to the gift of the Spirit. The ecclesiastical hierarchy and the sacrament of holy orders exist precisely so that the objective offer of grace made through the sacraments, the normative proclamation of the word and pastoral care may always remain alive and present among the faithful. Charisms, on the other hand, are freely distributed by the Holy Spirit, so that sacramental grace may bear fruit in Christian life in different ways and at every level. Consequently, everything in the church is understood in reference to grace. And this is the main important part, one of the important emphases of the Leonine Pontificate. The institution exists, so the institution of the church, the institution exists so that grace may always be offered, and charisms are given so that this grace may be received and bear fruit. Without charisms, there's a risk that Christ's grace offered in abundance may not find good soil to receive it. That is and this is like the gratuitously given graces. For example, the gift of teaching. That's a pretty basic one. The gift of teaching, which is able to exhort people in such ways as to make them well disposed towards receiving that objective order of grace. So you see how the way in which the two fit together. That is the reason why God raises up charisms, to awaken in hearts a desire to encounter Christ and a thirst for the divine life that he offers us, in a word, grace. And then he goes on to talk about the essential relation between missions and the pontificate. The unity and mission are two essential aspects of the church's life and two priorities of the Petrine ministry. For this reason, I ask all ecclesial associations and movements to cooperate faithfully and generously with the Pope, above all in two areas. First of all, by being a leaven of unity. All of you constantly experience, and this unity, by the way, is another emphasis of the Leonine Pontificate. All of you constantly experience the spiritual communion that unites you. It is the communion that the Holy Spirit brings about in the church. It is a unity that has its foundation in Christ, who draws us to himself and thus unites us with one another. St. Paulinus of Nola once wrote in a letter to St. Augustine, "We have one head, one grace that fills us. We live on one bread, we walk on one path, and we live in the same house. We are one in both the spirit and the body of the Lord. If we separate ourselves from the one, we become nothing." End quote. Seek to spread everywhere this unity that you yourselves experience in your groups and communities, always in communion with the church's pastors and in solidarity with other ecclesiastical realities. Draw close to those whom you meet, so that your charisms may ever be at the service of the unity of the church, and be a leaven of unity, communion, and fraternity in a world so torn by discord and violence. So that is that message, and I emphasized this a lot last time, so if you want to a longer explanation of this, you can look at the last stream. But this is that emphasis of the church as the leaven of unity. So really what you have is you have all of these other discordant realities in the world, because the world, the different ecclesial communions, sects, the different sects which are not members of the church but have baptism and other elements. But you have out in the world and out in all of these different communities, they're lacking something. They're lacking something unique which the church can give. So the church can offer them, and the church can bring a foretaste of that communion which they would have in the church, right? So this is the purpose behind bringing about this peace and unity. It is a proclamation of what the church offers to those who join her. It's a foretaste of what the church offers to those that join her. So therefore, the church, and especially the papacy, has a unique offering that she gives to the world. The church has this offering she gives to the world, and this is ultimately fulfilled when this isn't only the foretaste, isn't only the temporary fix that she offers in these individual situations, but actually they can come into the church and receive the gift in its fullness and its totality. So that's the part of the idea of spreading the leaven amongst those, the leaven of peace amongst those who are not within the church. It's very much drawn from a lot of what Leo XIII envisioned for himself in his own geopolitical action. Secondly, mission. The church's mission has been an important part of my own pastoral experience and has shaped my spiritual life. You too have experienced the spiritual journey. Your encounter with the Lord and the new life that filled your hearts gave rise to your desire to make him known to others. You have involved many others and devoted much time, enthusiasm, and energy to sharing the gospel in the most distant places, in the most challenging environments, enduring difficulties and failures. Always keep this missionary zeal alive in your midst. Today, as always, movements have a fundamental role in the work of evangelism. Among you, there are many generous, well-trained people with hands-on experience. This is a treasure that needs to be put to good use with a constant eye to new situations and challenges. Place your talents at the service of the church's mission, whether in places of first evangelism or in your parishes and local ecclesial communities, in order to reach those who, albeit distant, are often waiting without being aware of it to hear God's word of life. And what I want to highlight actually about this final exhortation to mission is when you read what St. Paul VI says, and when you read the Second Vatican Council talking about the lay apostolate, and especially talking about the temporal sphere, there is this message from the church that for the apostolate, we don't need to actually wait. We don't need to wait. We don't need to sit around. And this is the idea that he's getting at. You don't need to sit around and just twiddle our thumbs until some other guy makes the organization. You know, you have to sit there and you just have to wait, and eventually maybe a bishop will think of the exact idea that you're having when it comes to expanding the effects of Christ and the effects of the gospel. Like, you're just going to have to sit here and wait until some other guy does it, and then you can join his organization. That's not what the church says. The church says, actually, and this is in the Code of Canon Law, there's not only a right to these various types of organizations and these various types of lay apostolic action. There's not only a right, there's actually a duty that's present there. I think it's like Canon 220 to like 222, somewhere around there if you want to read more about that. There's not only a right, there's a duty. And there's this weird idea, and I've seen it in many different places in the stratosphere, but there's a stratosphere, and there's a pronouncement from the Tratisterium, which basically says that laymen ought not to do anything. And it's actually just bishops and priests who do all the stuff, right? It's a very fundamental proposition of the Tratisterium. But when it comes to the Catholic magisterium actually teaches, this is not only post-conciliar, it's pre-conciliar as well. The Catholic magisterium and the rights granted in canon law teach the exact opposite. There's actually, not only can we go and form different communities and form different groups that are doing apostolic work for the spreading of the gospel, not only can we actually have a duty to do these things in the various different spheres of life. That's going to look different for everybody, depending on what your unique charisms are, what your unique gifts are. But what he's saying with this exhortation to mission, and he says, quote, movements have a fundamental role in the work of evangelization. What he means by this, that movements have this fundamental role, is he's talking about these lay organizations that are popping up because there are various different people who have a vision. These people have a vision, and they see the ways in which the gospel could be spread in a different way that they don't see other people doing. And there's a right that you have. There's a right, and there's an obligation that you have, which is personal, to carry out these various different missions, this apostolate in your day-to-day life, and even in an organized way. You don't need to sit back and twiddle your thumbs and wait for the church or wait for some sort of approval from your bishop or whoever else it may be. This has already been granted to you. So I just wanted to emphasize that point in particular because a lot of people misunderstand this. Okay, so and then further, that was June 6th. Wow, we're 33 minutes into the stream, and I've only gotten 2 days in. Anyways, I think the other ones are much shorter. But June 7th, he had an audience about the Council of Nicaea. You know, you were hearing about the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea and how that was going to be a big, huge, groundbreaking, world-changing event. He gave a speech about it. He talked about the faith of Nicaea, synodality, the date of Easter, things like this. And he emphasized the role of grace and the Holy Spirit in union, and that union is not going to come through. He's talked about before, it doesn't come at the expense of faith and the expense of the loyalty that we have to the pontificate and all of these things. But here he talked about which I found to be super helpful when he said it before, because a lot of people want to have union despite the authentic elements of Catholicism that must be retained on pain of damnation. But he also talked about now the antecedent working of the Holy Spirit. And he talked about the necessity of grace for Christian unity. He says, quote, "Brothers and sisters, on this eve of Pentecost, let us remember that the unity for which Christians long will not be primarily the fruit of our own efforts, nor will it be realized through any preconceived model or blueprint. Rather, unity will be a gift received as Christ wills and by the means that he wills, by the working of the Holy Spirit. And so at this time, I would invite you all to stand so we can pray together to employ the Spirit's gift of unity." End quote. So now we're going to June 8th, which was Pentecost. He gave if you want to read his homily on Pentecost, it was really good. It was awesome. He was like exhorting people to overcome their passions. That was really cool. He was one of the things that he emphasizes a lot. He also emphasized and spoke out against individualism and the type of individualism that modern society can push us towards, which is something he's been writing about since his doctoral thesis, which was like 40 years ago. So he's been writing about this for like 40 years. But yeah, he spoke out against individualism, which is something that he mentions in many other places as well. So June 10th, he talks about the diplomatic corps again. You know, I will try to keep this a little bit more succinct because I've talked about the diplomatic corps a lot. So I hope you guys are interested in this type of thing, knowing how the Roman pontiff thinks about his role within the sort of geopolitical sphere throughout the world. So he talks about kind of three aspects. So the diplomatic corps is the most effective diplomatic corps in the world, which I kind of talked about earlier. The second is that the diplomatic corps, and this is a piece that a lot of individuals will accuse the diplomatic corps of not fulfilling. They'll say that they're somehow indifferentists and they're just trying to seek, peace for the sake of peace, and they actually don't. They have only humanitarian concerns, like they're some sort of, like Red Cross, UN sort of group. The second is that the diplomatic corps ultimately proclaims Christ. And then the third one is that the diplomatic corps are from Peter, and they're supposed to have a unique Petrine charism. So this is what he says, quote, "You are already, as people, an image of the Catholic Church, since a diplomatic corps as universal as ours does not exist in any other country in the world." Saying we got the best. We got the best diplomatic corps. All the other ones suck. To be honest, all the other ones suck. Do you see how many wars we're having? You see all the wars? Like, we have wars between Israel and Iran. We got wars between Ukraine and Russia. We got wars between Pakistan and India. We got all these wars. If we just let the Pope, if we just let Cardinal Parolin deal with all of this, we just let the Catholic diplomatic corps deal with all of this, we'd have no wars. We'd solve all the wars. Anyways, however, at the same time, I believe that one may equally say that no other country in the world has a diplomatic corps as united as you are. So true. Also, ours are united because a lot of times what you'll get in diplomatic corps, and this is especially evident in the American diplomatic corps, is there's actually like competing geopolitical visions within the diplomatic corps, which causes them to like war between themselves. And, when they actually go to try to meet, you have like different factions within each side of the agreements trying to be wrought. So it just ends up being awful. But not the Vatican. We're all united. We're all united in a common vision of matters of principle. Because I believe that one may equally say that no other country in the world has a diplomatic corps as united as you are, because our communion is not merely functional nor an idea. We're united in Christ, and we are united in the church. It is interesting to reflect on this fact that the diplomacy of the Holy See constitutes in its very staff a model, certainly not perfect, but very meaningful, of the message it proclaims, that of human fraternity and peace amongst all peoples. Awesome. I love when he talks about the diplomatic corps. Like, how does he? It's like a sort of weird thing to think. Pope Leo, he was just like a random bishop in Peru. He was the head of the Augustinian order, sure, but he didn't really do much diplomatic work. But he talks about it a lot, and he has some very, I think, fruitful reflections to think about. But he says, the request Peter makes to this man, so he's talking about the crippled man who Peter said, we have neither gold nor silver, but we have Christ to give you, and then he heals him. The request to make this man look at us makes us think. To look into to one's eyes means to build a relationship. The ministry of Peter is to create relationships, bridges. And a representative of the Pope, first and foremost, serves this invitation to look into the eyes. Always be the eyes of Peter. Be men awesome. Be men capable of building relationships. I'm glad we're getting yeah, okay. Sometimes they do translate as like men and women in some of the Leonine translations, but it's awesome to just not have to do this like forced thing where we always say men and women all the time. Be men capable of building relationships where it is hardest to do. But in doing so, preserve the same humility and the same realism of Peter, who is well aware that he does not have the solution to everything. I have neither silver nor gold, he says, but he knows what he does have, namely Christ, the deepest meaning of every existence. In the name of Jesus Christ, the Nazarene walk. This is awesome right here when he talks about the realism as well, because throughout various different periods of the church, unfortunately, we have had, and I mean, obviously we can't really blame them because there's difficulty. We're playing Monday morning quarterback. We're looking back at what the popes have done, and we're judging them from afar. While they're in the heat of it, it's very hard to understand what the best actions are doing because you don't have the foresight of history. But oftentimes throughout the history of the church, the popes in their temporal actions have been very unrealistic. They've been extremely unrealistic. So they've tried to make these type of they've tried to bring about their ministry in the temporal sphere in a way that is completely unrealistic and simply just doesn't work. Like they weren't doing anything wrong in principle. It's just like practically speaking, they were just kind of like just shouting into the void, basically. That happened with a lot of popes. They kind of just like tweeted into the void, when they were temporal difficulties. But when he's bringing up the realism of the diplomatic service, where they're just like, yeah, we don't really have temporal power. We don't have silver and gold. We don't really have this direct temporal authority or power that we used to have. But there are things that we do have, that we are able to offer. We need to have the realism of being able to offer those things. We can't really offer to the world what we don't have currently. So it's the realism is awesome to actually read about. Dear brothers, may you always be consoled by the fact that your service is sub umbra patri, as you will find engraved on the ring that you shall receive as a gift from me. Always feel you are bound to Peter, protected by Peter, sent by Peter. Only in obedience and effective communion with the Pope may your ministry be effective for the edification of the church in communion with the local bishops. True. This is true. Always have a blessing gaze, because the ministry of Peter is to bless. That is, always to know how to see the good, even that which is hidden, which is in the minority. Feel that you are missionaries sent by the Pope to be tools of communion, unity, serving the dignity of the human person, promoting sincere and constructive relations everywhere with the authorities with whom you are required to cooperate. May your competence always be enlightened by the sound decision for holiness. The saints who were in the diplomatic service of the Holy See, such as St. John the 23rd and St. Paul VI, provide an example to us. End quote. So that is his message to the diplomatic corps. Again, very awesome reflections that he's bringing forward. And then now let's move on to June the 11th. I think it's quite an accusation to say the popes were what? The popes were what? I mean, it's an accusation to say that some of the popes didn't have the best like domestic or international policy. I mean, that's kind of obvious. Unless you just want to pretend like every pope was just like a political genius. I mean, come on, Pius XI with Action Francais, that was a disaster, complete disaster. Anyways, June the 11th. June the 11th, he gave a general audience. It's again, I mentioned it last time. General audiences, sometimes they are basically like teaching series, like Theology of the Body, for example, was a series of general audiences from St. John Paul II. Pope Francis, he did general audiences on the virtues and vices, on the 10 Commandments, on, I think, the Apostles' Creed as well. He did a lot of different general audiences that were series, like teaching series, and those are really good for us to highlight and to explain part by part, to read the mind of the Pope. But these ones are basically like mini sermons on the parables, and those are, if you want to read his general audiences for that, awesome. I'm just not going to basically explain another person's sermon. It's kind of hard to comment on basically what is already a commentary on the biblical text. So if you want to read that, awesome. That's on June 11th. June 12th, he has an audience with the clergy of the Diocese of Rome. He repeats his exhortations to unity and communion, and he also speaks against isolation again. All things that we've already heard of, things that we've already expounded on. June 13th, he has a message on the 9th World Day of the Poor. And this was awesome because I've been reading about Catholic social teaching a lot recently, and Pope Leo, he just hit everything like right on the head. He just got it. It was awesome to see. Specifically on two things. First, he talks about the spiritual care of the poor. So, and this is actually connected with something that Venerable Pius XII says about the spiritual care of migrants. Basically, what you have is there is a tendency, and this is a tendency that a lot of people will accuse the church of, by the way, the post-conciliar church of. There's a tendency of over-materializing or over-emphasizing the corporal works of mercy and an over-materializing of the care that we have for people. So basically, the idea is that you have, let's say, the, starving children of Gaza. Let's use that as an example. We would be detrimentally treating that situation if we merely cared for their material needs, fed them, clothed them, whatever, without any sort of relation to their spiritual good as well. Because the good for the body, the good of the body is ordered to the good of the soul. So Pius XII brings this up where there had been a bunch of different organizations which were made to care for migrants, but these organizations were basically only concerned with the material good of the migrants. They weren't really concerned with their spiritual good. So like providing priests who would be able to care for, local communities that might not speak English, be able to provide parishes, stuff like that. So Pope Leo, he actually brings this fact up. He brings this point up about the worst offense against the poor is not the fact that the poor are not given material care. Actually, the worst offense against the poor is the fact that they're not given spiritual care. So the spiritual works of mercy are being completely ignored when it comes to the poor, and that's an even greater problem. And it's a very big problem when you have people who only care for the material well-being of the poor, and they don't actually care for the spiritual well-being of the poor. So this is what he says, quote, "The gravest form of poverty is not to know God. As Pope Francis wrote in Evangelii Gaudium, the worst discrimination which the poor suffer is the lack of spiritual care. The great majority of the poor have a special openness to the faith. They need God, and we must not fail to offer them his friendship, his blessing, his word, the celebration of the sacraments, and a journey of growth and maturity in the faith. Here we see a basic and essential awareness of how we can find our treasure in God. As the Apostle John insists, if anyone says, 'I love God,' but hates his brother, he is a liar. For whoever does not love his brother, whom he has seen, cannot love God, whom he has not seen. This is a rule of faith and the secret of hope. All this earth's goods, material reality, worldly pleasures, economic prosperity, however important, cannot bring happiness to our hearts. Wealth often disappoints. It can lead to tragic situations of poverty. Above all, the poverty born of the failure to recognize our need for God and of the attempt to live without him. A saying of St. Augustine comes to mind. Let all your hope be in God. Feel your need for him, and let him fill that need. Without him, whatever you possess will only make you feel the more empty." End quote. So yeah, the spiritual care of the poor, that's the first aspect he brings up. Awesome, amazing. And the second one actually that he brings up, which I found to be super important, is the Catholic teaching on the universal destination of goods. So this is one of the oppositions that Catholic social teaching has to pure capitalism. The fact that we believe in the universal destination of goods, that there should be a distribution of these goods. The state should facilitate this. And actually there is, for example, an immediate corollary of this is that the church talks about a right to work. You have a right, because you have an obligation, you have a corresponding right. You have an obligation to fulfill the material needs of your family. So along with this, there's actually a right that you have, that the civil society needs to form laws and form different institutions in order to carry out the disposition of society to present these various goods of employment. So this is about the universal destination of goods, but he actually connects poverty with universal destination of goods in such a way as to remind us that actually poverty is not simply a problem of charity. So, we don't have enough rich people or people who are, upper middle class who are donating to charities. It's not as much a problem of charity, although we ourselves can gain many spiritual merits through our almsgiving. It's not merely a problem of charity. It's actually a problem of justice. There's actually, when you have poverty, there's an issue of justice there, where when it comes to the very constituency of society, in ordinary circumstances, what you're having is you're having the society which is not disposed in a certain way as to fulfill that right to work for various people. This is what he says. Quote, poverty has structural causes that must be addressed and eliminated. In the meantime, each of us is called to offer new signs of hope that will bear witness to Christian charity, just as many saints have done over the centuries. Hospitals and schools, for instance, were institutions established to reach out to the most vulnerable and marginalized. These institutions should be a part of every country's public policy. Yet, wars and inequalities often prevent this from happening. Today, signs of hope are increasingly found in care homes, communities for minors, centers for listening and acceptance, soup kitchens, homeless shelters, and low-income schools. How many of these quiet signs of hope often go unnoticed, yet are so important for setting aside our indifference and inspiring others to become involved in various forms of volunteer work. In this promotion of the common good, so this is the part that's important. In this promotion of the common good, our social responsibility is grounded in God's creative act, which gives everyone a share in the goods of the earth. So this is the universal destination of goods. The universal destination of good, the very creative act of God. He has created all things for the sustenance of man. This is very clear in sacred scripture. Like those goods, the fruits of human labor should be equally accessible to all. Notice this is like an awesome distinction that he's making, because really there are the material goods which are destined to all men, and then there's the labor which makes those goods fruitful. And he's saying that actually the fruits of human labor should be equally accessible to all men. That's talking about a certain universal right to work. So beside all of the charitable deeds we're doing to people, there's actually a matter of justice insofar as we need to present opportunities for those who are able to labor and to be able to make fruitful, various instances of capital in order to, have a wage which is able to care for the material needs of their body. Helping the poor is a matter of justice before a question of charity. As St. Augustine observed, you give bread to a hungry person, but it would be better if none were hungry, so that you would have no need to give it away. You clothe the naked, but would that all were clothed, and that there is no need to supply this lack. Okay, so now moving on to June 14th. So that was the World Day of the Poor on June 13th. This message, honestly, I'm almost at an hour. Everybody wanted me to keep this to less than an hour, but no, screw it. I'll just keep yapping. I don't care. I'll just keep yapping. I'll make this one a little bit longer, just because we have on June 14th, we have the message of the Holy Father Leo XIV to the young people of Chicago and to the entire world. If you don't know, Pope Leo, obviously, he's from Chicago, but and a lot of people know this, but he's a White Sox fan. But what they decided to do is they decided to have a mass in the White Sox stadium, and Pope Leo sent a message to young people. And it was on or the day before, I think it was the day before the Feast of the Holy Trinity. She actually gave a message which was, it was connecting the Holy Trinity to many of the different social problems among young people, which is just awesome. He talks about individualism and isolation as a frequent topic of his. And he talks about that in reference to the Trinity. He talks about mission, specifically mission and Catholic action as ways of overcoming the individualism and the isolation, which we feel, a way of actually not turning into yourself, but a way of going outside of yourself. Honestly, you should read the whole thing, but I will just read this portion. It's awesome. It's just a really good message. So what he says, quote, "The feast of the most holy Trinity," and I begin with that because the Trinity is a model of God's love for us. God, Father, Son, and Spirit, three persons in one God, united in the depth of love and community, sharing that communion with all of us. I'd like to send a special word of greeting to all the young people, those of you gathered together today, and many of you who are perhaps watching this greeting through technological means. As you grew up together, many of you realize, especially having lived through the time of the pandemic, times of isolation, great difficulty, sometimes even difficulties in your families or in our world today. Sometimes it may be that the context of your life has not given you the opportunity to live the faith, to live as participants in a faith community. And I'd like to take this opportunity to invite each one of you to look into your own hearts, to recognize that God is present and that perhaps in many different ways God is reaching out to you, calling you, inviting you to know his son, Jesus Christ, through the scriptures, perhaps through a friend or a relative, a grandparent who might be a person of faith. But to discover how important it is for each one of us to pay attention to the presence of God in our own hearts, to that longing of love in our lives, for searching, a true searching, for finding the ways that we may be able to do something with our own lives to serve others. And in that service to others, so he's talking about, he basically describes this, and you'll see he's describing this as basically like a very simple way of talking about the work of mission. And in this service to others, we may find that coming together in friendship, building up community. We too can find true meaning in our lives, moments of anxiety, of loneliness. So many people who suffer from different experiences of depression or sadness, they can discover that the love of God is truly healing, that it brings hope, and that actually coming together as friends, as brothers and sisters, in community, in a parish, in an experience of living our faith together, we can find that the Lord's grace, that the love of God can truly heal us, can give us the strength that we need, can be the source of that hope that we all need in our lives. To share that message of hope with one another in outreach and service, and looking for ways to make our world a better place, gives true life to all of us and is a sign of hope for the whole world. To, once again, the young people who are gathered here, I'd like to say that you are the promise of hope for so many of us. The world looks to you as you look around yourselves and say, we need you. We need you to come together to share with us in this common mission, as church and in society, of announcing a message of true hope and of promoting peace, promoting harmony among all people. We have to look beyond our own, if you will, egotistical ways. We have to look for ways of coming together and promoting a message of hope. St. Augustine says to us that if we want the world to be a better place, we have to begin with ourselves. We have to begin with our own lives, our own hearts, end quote. That's a portion of the speech. I'd recommend you read the whole speech because it was pretty good. And now on June 15th is when we get the Jubilee of Sport. And the Jubilee of Sport is actually on the feast of the Holy Trinity. So what you get is Pope Leo, he attempts to connect sports with the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. And he does it pretty well. He does a good job. I loved it. It was awesome. And then he goes on in the rest of the speech. If you're interested in this sort of stuff, you can read about it. He gives like practical reflections on sports, how sports gets rid of individualism, how sports brings together communion and union in society. He talks about a bunch of different things when it comes to sports. If you're that interested, you can it's June 15th, just read the homily. But he connects the doctrine of the Holy Trinity to sports. So this is what he says, quote, "While we are celebrating today the solemnity of the Most Holy Trinity, we're also making the Jubilee of Sport. This combination of Trinity and sport is somewhat unusual, yet the juxtaposition is not inappropriate. Every good and worthwhile human activity is in some way a reflection of God's infinite beauty, and sport is certainly one of these. For God is not immobile and closed in on himself, but activity, communion, dynamic relationship between the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, which opens up to humanity into the world. Theologians speak of perichoresis. The life of God is a kind of dance, a dance of mutual love. This dynamism of God's inner life gives birth to life. We are created by a God who finds joy in giving existence to his creatures, who delights in our world, as we have heard in the first reading. Some fathers of the church go so far as to speak of a Deus ludens, a God who plays. Sport can thus help. The God who plays, yeah. Sport can thus help us to encounter the triune God because it challenges us to relate to others and with others, not only outwardly but also and above all interiorly. Otherwise, sports becomes nothing more than an empty competition, inflated ego. End quote. So yeah, that's the application of the doctrine of the Holy Trinity to sports. On June 16th, he gives various different audiences. He gives an audience to the bishops of Madagascar. So, if you're really interested in Madagascar, you can read it. I don't know. I'm not interested in Madagascar. Sorry, Pope Leo. He gives one to some astrophysics students, the audience, the participants in the Astrophysics Summer School of the Vatican Observatory. I don't really care about astrophysics. It's probably pretty boring. Then the last one, there's an audience for pilgrims attending the beatification of an African saint. If you want to read that, you can read it. So that's what happened on June 16th. June 17th, which is yesterday, there's some cool stuff that happens. He gives an audience to the bishops of the Italian Episcopal Conference. He talks about the role of the Episcopal Conference to the civil authority. So the role of the bishops to the civil authority, awesome. It says, quote, "The principle of communion is also reflected in a healthy cooperation with the civil authorities. The Italian Episcopal Conference is indeed a space for discussion and the synthesis of the bishop's thought regarding issues most relevant for the common good. Where necessary, it guides and coordinates the relations between the individual bishops and the regional episcopal conferences with such authorities at the local level," end quote. So he emphasizes for the bishops their relationship of cooperation with the civil authorities in communicating the teaching of the church, of bringing about the common good. So he says that. It's kind of cool. He also encourages people to follow the evangelical program of Evangelii Gaudium. So that's a good, I think it's an apostolic letter, apostolic exhortation, I think, actually. Or is it encyclical? I can't remember which one. But you should read Evangelii Gaudium. It basically, he has emphasized since, I think, like the second day he was Pope, over and over and over again. I think I've mentioned this like 3 or 4 times since the beginning of this stream, that this is something that he mentions all the time. This is the model of evangelism that he is following. These are the things that he wants to continue with the model of evangelism. So it would be a good thing to read if you want to understand Leo through the lens of what Pope Francis says. And he also mentions the lay apostolate again. He has this awesome quote. He says, quote, "Take care that the lay faithful, nourished with the word of God, informed in the social doctrine of the church, are agents of evangelization in the workplace, in schools, in hospitals, in social and cultural environments, in the economy, and in politics," end quote. So yeah, basically the role of the bishops in encouraging Catholic action within their realms. Okay, and then I wanted to actually finish off before I get to any questions that maybe had. I wanted to finish off with what Pope Leo says about the current situation going on with Iran and Israel, and all of those. So this is what he says. He says, quote, "Dear brothers and sisters, the church is brokenhearted at the cry of pain rising from places devastated by war, especially Ukraine, Iran, Israel, and Gaza," which is funny that he distinguishes Israel from Gaza, by the way. "We must never get used to war. Indeed, the temptation to have recourse to powerful and sophisticated weapons needs to be rejected. Today, when every kind of weapon produced by modern science is used in war, the savagery of war threatens to lead the combatants to barbarities far surpassing those of former ages. For this reason, in the name of human dignity and international law, I reiterate to those in positions of responsibility the frequent warning of Pope Francis. War is always a defeat, and that of Pope Pius XII. Nothing is lost with peace. Everything may be lost with war," end quote. Okay, so now I'll get into any questions. Okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely do you think that His Holiness Pope Leo XIV will canonize the Holy Bishop of Ypres, Cornelius Jansen? 0. But thank you for being a member. Okay, let me see. Just making sure there's nothing super important. Yeah. I don't care about Astro. I didn't say that. John of St. Thomas was a heliocentrist, Wagner. He was real for that. He was based. Okay. Anyways, Incoming skip donut. Oh yeah, I have to remember because I have to make sure I didn't miss any of them because for some reason StreamYard's being dumb and it's not showing me them anymore. Hassan, did you have to kick anyone out? Okay, doesn't look like I missed any. Okay, good. Yeah, I'm doing the justification stream tomorrow. This weekend, I'm going to be out of state again. I was just out of state last weekend. Dude, I feel like I can't wait until I never have to travel again. I hate traveling. Like, you know how all the white girls are just like, I love traveling so much. Traveling's awesome. Traveling sucks. It's the worst. You got to get in a plane. You got to sit in the plane. You got to have all of these layovers, and you got to get a ride to the airport and back from the airport. It sucks. It's the worst. For Hassan, thank you. Okay, well, it doesn't look like I missed anything, but I hope that you all have a fantastic rest of your week. Remember to tune in tomorrow. I'll probably be doing a Q&A tomorrow, and I'll be doing the stream on justification. So all of you, just have a wonderful weekend. And as always, God bless.